Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine War News Update. First part thereof for the 12th of April 2025. I have lots of family round today for another gathering. Been away for a week gathering and now gathering back here. So I'm not sure about the output for my other videos today. I'll have to wait and see. But we'll certainly have this one. We'll look at the Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply. You can find them in the description, linked in the description to the video below. Talked about how there is quite a lot of snow across a lot of Ukraine. That will have affected the outcomes across the front line for the last 24 hours plus. That could have an effect in the numbers we see today. 1,240 personnel lost is a high number still, but below the 1,300 we are used to. 11 tanks is actually around about the daily averages, to snip above. So that's good news for the Ukrainians there. 7 troop-carrying AFVs is much lower than the daily average, and 49 artillery systems is about 2.5 times the daily average, or just under. So some fairly consistent numbers there. Tanks are looking pretty good as a category, and also artillery systems fairly decent again. 2 multiple launch rocket systems to be added, and 128 vehicles and fuel tanks. So yeah, I don't know whether there's any particular conclusion I can derive from those figures, but fairly good for the Ukrainians. General Syrskyi, the commander-in-chief, has said the attempts of the occupiers to push through our defences are resulting in record losses for the Russian invaders. Since the beginning of the year, the total losses of the enemy in personnel have exceeded 140,000 people. So he's saying that, this has been a very bad year for the Russians. Around 200 Chinese mercenaries are fighting alongside Russian forces in Ukraine. That's according to Reuters. US officials say they are poorly trained and have minimal impact. Meanwhile, Chinese officers approved by Beijing have been observing the war from behind Russian lines. Okay, so that second part I think is possibly more important. Although, like I've said before, even if you just think the North Koreans are cannon fodder and kind of dismiss them, I think that's a dangerous thing. So yeah, okay, the 200 Chinese mercenaries might be poorly trained and have minimal impact, but they have an impact. They are troops that the Ukrainians have to kill in order to prevail. These are troops that, if they aren't killed, will kill Ukrainians. Okay, so this requires effort, and it will be attritional for the Ukrainians. So don't just dismiss poorly trained troops out of hand. There's a piece by Radio Free Europe here, Radio Liberty, and I think it goes to show the importance of the media institution, and I hope their funding does get sorted out. You're a man, be a man. How the Chinese are recruited by Russia to kill in Ukraine, with sign-on promises of up to $20,000 and a monthly income on top. It's not tough to recruit new meat, and Beijing knows about it and permits it. And of course, there's a huge resource to draw from there in terms of 1 billion people. There are going to be an awful lot of disaffected people without too many hopes of social mobility and whatnot, and joining the Russian army could be their route out of destitution or something like that. Do you know what I mean? There are going to be a lot of people that Russia could conceivably draw from. Now, units of the special forces have captured 14 Russian servicemen, including 3 officers in the Kursk region over the past few days. That's interesting because it indicates that the Ukrainians aren't just sitting defensively in the Kursk region, that they are sort of pushing back. They are able to take some POWs there, although that's special forces, so they're going to be no doubt doing sort of smaller crack attacks into behind the enemy lines and whatnot, but capturing 14 Russian servicemen is a good haul there. Now, here we have another video of a Russian with a donkey, and yes, anecdotes or whatever, but we piece these together. Anton Gerashenko reports this. The quote from the video is, "There are no vehicles, so we have to use donkeys. See, this is what we've come to." The total spending of the Russian army has grown to 13 trillion rubles, $155 billion, and we are at a place where we have at least one Russian soldier, not the first one, saying we are forced to use donkeys because we have no equipment left. And actually, I'll bring this in now. So Russia's summer offensive is doomed to fail. With forces plagued by problems, experts say Moscow will not be able to capitalize on any gains renewed assaults may bring. This is in the Daily Telegraph. The most likely direction of Russia's breakthrough is in the Sumy region, but Putin has little chance of success, says Savchenko Volodymyr. Russia has lost about 3,000 tanks and 9,000 armored vehicles. New attacks are carried out mostly by infantry. New recruits are thrown into battle after a few days or a maximum of a month training. Attacks are carried out by small groups without the possibility of a large-scale breakthrough. Ukrainian drones block the transfer of Russian troops and equipment. A massive accumulation of forces becomes impossible. Russia is trying to create the illusion of a major operation, but there is no movement or breakthroughs on the ground. And by the end of the year, Russia will be on the verge of technical exhaustion. All that having been said, that's broadly where they have been for the last 6 months, and they're still grinding on. So take that with a pinch of salt. But the idea is that a major successful counteroffensive is going to be hard to come by for the Russians. Now, a HIMARS strike we can see here on a book. This is another book system taken out. It shows that HIMARS are still being used, so that's good news, and that air defense systems are still being attrited by the Ukrainians. What else do we have? Just going to go through. Okay, yeah, I'm probably more interested in this because I'm British. But this is an interesting Times article. But behind closed doors, the Ukrainians refer to British military chiefs as the brains of the anti-Putin coalition. Their role goes deeper than many may think. Our long read on the role of CDS, his principals and lieutenants, and General Hockenhall in the war. Okay, so we'll dip into this. So the untold story of British military chiefs' crucial role in Ukraine. I've said for a long time that Britain does a lot more in Ukraine than people realise, and that's in terms of special forces, in terms of all sorts of intelligence and equipment and personnel, and there's a lot going on in Ukraine, and Britain does have its finger in quite a lot of pies there. The other difference of between say Britain and the US, I don't know about other countries, I presume other countries are more similar to Britain. The US doesn't permit its military figures to go into Ukraine, so any like high level meeting between say General Kvoli and Syrsky would have to take place outside of the country, whereas Radakin, he's met Zelensky like 10 times. He's just always in or very often in Ukraine, often in plain clothes for safety. So our military leaders freely go into Ukraine, and that allows us to have a much I think more fluid relationship with Ukraine. So the untold story of British military chiefs' crucial role in Ukraine, the extent of the UK's involvement in the 2023 spring offensive against Russia, the last minute dashes to Kiev, battle plans and intelligence has remained largely hidden until now. I'm not going to read too much of this, but I advise you go and read it. I had to look at it through archive because I don't have a time to count. Behind closed doors, the Ukrainians referred to British military chiefs, as I mentioned, as a brains of the anti-Putin coalition made up of America, the UK, and dozens of other like-minded nations known for having the daring do to deploy troops inside the country when no one else would, and UK's role in the war has gone deeper than many observers may think. Most crucially, the Times can reveal the Americans provided the cream of the weapons to Ukraine and the precise targeting data to use them effectively. It was the British military chiefs under Operation Scorpius holding Washington and Kiev's difficult relationship together. Okay, so then it goes on to talk about different areas of the war, different periods of the war, early summer 2023, and we're talking about the spring offensive. And we have, well, first of all, it says here, it was at this point that Sir Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, a state-educated boy from Oldham, and his two principal lieutenants, Lieutenant General Sir Rhodey Walker and Lieutenant General Sir Charlie Stickland, cemented the respect of the Ukrainians and Americans alike. The story of this pivotal moment and the role Britain played, however, begins some 6 months earlier. So this was in a run-up to the much anticipated, what should have been a spring offensive and ended up being a summer offensive, and it ended up not being particularly successful. But the British and American were involved in that, but they were initially kind of reticent, and they said, well, okay, if we're going to do it, let's go in and fully support Ukraine. But there were some issues, and we'll read about them. Britain, for its part, would become the first Western country to provide Ukraine with long-range Storm Shadow missiles to boost its chances of success, Wallace said. UK troops... Wallace, of course, was at the time, the Conservative Secretary of Defence, He did a pretty good job, to be totally fair. So, in fact, I think he did a very good job with the Ukraine. To provide Ukraine with long-range Storm Shadow cruise missiles to boost its chances of success, Wallace said. UK troops were secretly sent to fit Ukraine's aircraft with the missiles and teach troops how to use them. It would not be the first time British troops have been deployed on the ground. A few dozen regular British troops had already been sent to Kiev to instruct new and returning military recruits to use NLAWs, British supplied anti-tank missiles that were delivered in February 2022 as the invasion was just beginning. So again, here we have more evidence being provided that British troops have been in Ukraine training Ukrainians. Although British training troops have been deployed in Ukraine since 2015, they've been forced to pull out in February 2022 amid fears Russia could launch an attack at any time. Then this is a map. Oh no, not this map. No, we're coming to another one. Sorry. Then there was a counteroffensive in May. But what this article details really well is that problem that we talked about for ages. And I was saying that Ukraine's holding on because they haven't received all the weapons they need. But for every week that they hold on, the Russians dig in more, put more mines in the minefields, they excavate more trenches, etc., etc. So you leave it longer so that you're prepared, and the Russians become arguably even more prepared. And this was a dilemma. So, but the Ukrainians had a problem. There had been a plan for all of the kit from the US, UK, and others to arrive by the end of March, but the end of March came and the end of April and then the end of May. Quote, Ukraine kept waiting until they would have all the kit. We kept saying that you just need to go. Russia's not strong. You need to challenge them. You've got enough kit, UK military source says. But at that point, the weapons they had been given for the counteroffensive by that point matched those that were available for the entire British army. As time went on, though, the Russians seized the opportunity and dug in. And that's, I think they'll come to rue that. Wallace was getting pushed back from inside the MOD. So this is Ben Wallace, the Secretary of Defense, and the Foreign Office at the same time because of nervousness that giving Ukraine increasingly heavy weaponry could escalate tensions with Russia. The Kremlin had been rattling the nuclear saber and in March said it would deploy tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus for the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It would deploy nuclear weapons outside its borders. For the strike element of the strategy, there needed to be one main effort. The Ukrainians should mass forces and firepower at one point of contact with the best chance of breaking through. British and American military chiefs advised, and of course this happened now. Eventually at Robotyne, which was the strongest point. So I think that's a worse position that they chose. I can't remember who's responsible for that. I'm sure some were saying the US might have played a part in that, but it might have been Zelensky actually. But we also find out that President Zelensky had other ideas. He was persuaded by General Sursky, Ukraine's ground forces commander, to instead attempt a strategy of wreaking havoc in the north, as well as playing as hard as possible in the southeast. Instead of punching through in the south and severing the land bridge between Russia and occupied Crimea, the Ukrainians split their fighting power. The punch through never quite came. So the idea that they were fighting hard up in Bakhmut area as well as fighting hard down in the south meant that they split their forces. This frustrated the Americans, as did the fact that the Ukrainian forces on the ground were moving slower than the US demanded, and they were moving slower, of course, because there's so many obstacles. Quote, the Americans were impatient. They got to the stage where they had their war games and it was time to go, one former senior defense source said. The Ukrainians said everyone, including the Americans and the British, had underestimated the Russian obstacles ahead of the fact that and the facts of the modern battlefield. The path was littered with Russian landmines, and those trying to clear them faced the added threat of a drone exploding over their heads. Russia's Armed Forces Commander General Valery Zaluzhny, the boss of Sursky, who had a photograph of Radakin on his office wall, was desperately trying to manage a morale crisis. To that end, he explained to British military chiefs, soldiers, many conscripts in their 30s and 40s rather than their early 20s were spending only 3 days on the front line. The first was settling in day. On the second day, they would push forward by 200 to 300 meters. The third day, they would consolidate, ready to hand over to fresh troops. It was slow and tedious. Ukraine's closest allies thought. The Americans wondered what the hell is going on and urged the Ukrainians to go at a much harder pace. It is understood. It was at this point that relations between the Ukrainians and Americans hit rock bottom. So this was a period of poor relationship between the two countries. Mark Milley and General Christopher Caffarelli commander of the US Army in Europe and Africa, were very frustrated with Zaluzhny. Zaluzhny, in turn, was frustrated with the pressure from America. And I wonder if this is why Zaluzhny ended up going and becoming the UK ambassador. Breaking off a long-planned holiday, Tony Radakin told Wallace, with whom he worked closely, that he needed to get out to Ukraine to pull both sides together. It was getting too fractious, Radakin was said to have told him. The plan was that Radakin would sit down with Zaluzhny, hear the Ukrainians out, and try to explain their perspective to the Americans over a video call from Kiev. He boarded the Soviet-era night train from Poland to Kiev to talk it through in person with Zaluzhny, who would later become Ukraine's top diplomat to Britain and a favourite to succeed Zelensky. It was an unusual war where America had been operating with strong leadership but at a distance while providing extraordinary support that far surpassed that of the Allies. Almost from the beginning, Biden had been questioned over the concern that America was more involved in Ukraine than the administration was letting on, and that it risked becoming a proxy war, especially with nuclear consequences. And then that was, of course, denied. And in the coming months, the American chiefs were to begin wargaming the spring offensive. The Americans went to Ukraine only on rare occasions because of concerns they would be seen to be too involved in the war, unlike Britain's military chiefs, who were given the freedom to go whenever necessary. Sometimes their visits were so sensitive they went in civilian clothing. And then there's lots more talk about, those meetings and preparations. War games involving the British and Americans continued, and supply needs were identified and communicated to London, Washington and other European capitals. The UK chiefs posed questions such as whether a plan of attack would work, and if the numbers added up for certain offensives. Radakin took on a wider role that traditionally held by a chief of defence staff, leading the UK efforts on Ukraine across the government. He was a person keeping the US on side and keeping the Biden administration leaning into Ukraine, a colleague said. So Tony Radakin, it could turn out, after this war is over, could be understood to be far more critical a person in this war than we had previously imagined, properly keeping the Americans on side with the Ukrainians. Anyway, the article goes on and on. Lots more in there, but I'll leave it there for you. Okay, on to distance munitions and airstrikes. There were 88 Shaheeds sent, so another day of less than 100. Fewer than 100, 56 of them shot down, 24 taken out by electronic warfare. So that's 80 out of 88 taken out. So that's less than 10% interception rate. That's pretty good compared to where it has been at around sometimes 20, 22% and more. So not too bad, but I don't have any details about any strikes last night, either in Ukraine or into Russia. Sorry, I keep hitting my microphone. That's what happens when you put it closer to your face. Russia launched a drone attack on Kyiv, hitting the Sviatoshninsky district. One warehouse caught fire, covering 1,500 square meters. It's now under control. Another blaze broke out in the industrial site, affecting 2 warehouses with partial destruction. Firefighting continues. So there are some strikes on industrial targets in Kyiv. Don't know if they have any military dimension. Then we hear that Kyiv is to expand production of Shahed targeting interceptor drones after successful testing. Ukraine has developed several interceptors and tested one of them in Kyiv Oblast over the last month, a minister says. And this is one I think that we saw on a video where when the Belgians were around and they were looking at these, and there are some claims that they've been fairly successful over the last month in intercepting Russian Shahed drones. But a quiet night. Paul Sweeney's basically said the same, looking at firms data. There's not really a lot to report. And again, you would if you could, you answer, you can't. So why is it the Ukrainians aren't doing that? Or is there another reason? Is this to do with the halt on striking energy infrastructure? I think the Ukrainians would love to still be striking at oil refineries, but they don't seem to be doing that at the moment. Now, moving on to other bits and pieces, Tatargami, Ukrainian sources said, while our team continues, that's a intelligence team, working on the latest updates, here are a few updates on the current state of the front line. 1. Despite holding the advantage along much of the front line, Russia's winter campaign yielded limited results, indicating Ukraine's situation is not dire. 2. The Kursk area now appears more stable than in February. At that time, Russian forces had established a foothold in Zvirove, with deeper advances into Kursk looking imminent. Since then, not only have the Russians stalled, they've actually lost some ground. 3. The overall composition and number of Russian forces near Sumy Oblast currently seem insufficient to support a large-scale offensive operation deep into the region. That's kind of what the Telegraph article was also saying. 4. Russian troops continue to expand their bridgehead on the right bank of the Oskil River near Dvorichne in the Kharkiv Oblast, so that's up north of Kupiansk. While Ukrainian defenders were not able to fully contain the enemy, Russian progress has slowed. 5. Parts of Toretsk remain under Ukrainian control, although Ukrainian forces face significant challenges. Situation is not as dire as many, including Russian analysts and bloggers, have claimed Toretsk fell over a month ago, had predicted. 6. Our team, anticipates increased activity around Chasiv Yar, the likely objective of reaching Konstantinivka later this year. We also expect Russian offensive actions to expand further to the south in the coming months. 7. The summary: the situation for the Ukrainian troops remains complicated, but the overall balance favours Russia. That said, despite recent Russian efforts to portray Ukraine's position as dire, they have so far failed to capitalise operationally or strategically inside of Ukraine. It's not great news for Ukraine, but it's not bad news. It's like the Russians are struggling and the Ukrainians are not doing as bad as some people had predicted. According to French Space Command, France is monitoring 3 new Russian satellites, one of which has released a mysterious object. So, cryptic and, mysterious. French are involved up in space there. Now, we're going to look at a few business or economic indicators. Demand for truck drivers in Russia has collapsed due to the bankruptcies of freight carriers. And we'll talk about bankruptcies in a second. Other than a constantly expanding genocidal war segment of the Russian economy, the real economy is an absolute state of collapse, says Jay in Kyiv. Job openings for truck drivers are down 87.5%. And then Russia, according to the Kyiv Insider, now faces an epidemic in debt default, with defaults already growing. Now the added strain of about half of new loans being issued at rates of 24%. So we have, I can't read that, but I'm sure someone can. The structure and volume of loans provided to legal entities, residents and individual entrepreneurs in rubles by ranges of the interest rates at which the funds were provided. 24% and above, you can see that huge amount of loans at very challenging rates, and then very few at these lower rates compared to what it was looking like. So 8 to 12%, this is grey area, back in early 2024, a lot of loans at that rate, and now it's just hardly anything. It's all about 20% and above, huge rates, and so defaults have been going through the roof, and then that results in bankruptcies, which means that logistics carriers are not getting work because things aren't being shifted because people have gone bust. And then you have this: Russian Urals oil fell below $50 a barrel for the first time since July 23, according to Argus on Wednesday. And I've reported this, but a bit more detail. April 9th, Urals shipped from the port of Primorsk was sold at 47.54 per barrel, and in Novorossiysk at 48.39. Compared to mid-January, when Urals were $70 and above, the Russian grade has fallen by almost $20, almost 33%. At the same time, the oil price is budgeted at $69.7 a barrel. So they're like $20 below the budgeted price. It's an absolute shocker. Compared with mid-January, the Urals cost... at the same time, the oil price... if the price does not stabilize, the government will have to revise the volume of expenditure. Wow, absolutely incredible. There's a repetition in there. That's why I got confused. Good news for the Ukrainians, bad news for the Russians. Now, we're going on to talk about peace negotiations. There's quite a bit of controversy going on. Trump has made it clear, says White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, that he is disappointed with both Russia and Ukraine. Of course, both sides. You can't just criticize Russia, so let's criticize Ukraine as well. But we have the leverage to negotiate peace. The president is determined to see it through. Okay, well, we heard yesterday that Witkoff went to visit Putin, and it was recorded, his meeting, and loads of people are going mental about this, and rightly so. Witkoff placing his hand over his heart to express his devotion to war criminal Putin and then sheepishly following it in tow behind him is utterly disgusting. The idea that Steve Witkoff is just a puppet of Putin seems to be completely valid, because when he goes like this, meeting Putin, that's a natural thing. He's in awe of Putin. This is completely wrong-headed. Witkoff should be so wary about Putin, should be thinking at all times of Putin as an adversary, and I don't think this is an attempt to butter Putin up. This is a genuine in awe of a global leader moment. Why you put this rank amateur, this real estate mogul, in a room with Putin to negotiate about and without Ukraine, I think is unconscionable. So as Dominic Hessek says, the American envoy President Putin put his right hand on his heart when meeting the greatest criminal of the modern world, Putin, who is responsible for hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of lost and crippled human lives. This is USA Today. How sad. Lots of people talking about this meeting. Witkoff's insanity. He told Trump that the fastest way to do a deal is handing Russia full control over 4 Ukrainian regions. As I mentioned yesterday, Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhia. Trump ally Keith Kellogg pushed back on this, saying Ukraine will never agree to unilaterally surrender its land. This shows that Witkoff doesn't have a clue what he's talking about. He doesn't understand Ukraine. And sending him out there to speak to Putin, to get manipulated by Putin, is utterly unacceptable. As Michael McFaul, a former ambassador to Russia, said, I really hope this reporting is inaccurate. But if true, Witkoff is offering Putin even more Ukrainian territory than Russia occupies right now. This is insanely bad negotiating. And then when you look at Witkoff on the socials, it is all about that hand on his heart. Next to destroyed playgrounds where Ukrainian children were killed just days before. And lots of people, they're next to have that on. They've got that clip of him doing that to his heart, just on loop. Just loop it round, put it in your hand on his heart. It's just, Putin. Look at the excitement and the reverence to which he gives Putin, and then Putin just turns around and he follows it. It's just like, I can't believe this. I can't believe you just got this amateur in there. It's embarrassing. And then he's throwing Ukraine under the bus. Then you got the mineral deal. The US now wants to take control of Gazprom gas pipeline in Ukraine. The draft agreement on minerals proposed by the US contains a requirement that US government's International Development Finance Corporation take control of the Russian Gazprom gas pipeline through Ukraine to Europe. They're just, working on behalf of Russia now? Just absolutely incredible. So then Keith Kellogg's met with Trump, and he's pushed back against Witkoff, saying Ukraine, though willing to negotiate some terms related to disputed land, would never agree to unilaterally cede total ownership of the territories to Russia. Of course, that's probably going to annoy Trump, because he just thinks land, give it away, buy it, whatever. He has no connection to this land, and he has no understanding that Ukraine and Ukrainians will just... This is not something they're going to tolerate. That doesn't compute for Trump. He just wants to do a deal, get it sewn up, bish bash bosh, onto extracting natural resources from both countries. The meeting ended with Trump making a decision to change the US strategy. Witkoff travelled to Russia Friday to meet Putin, and then come away saying, yep, best thing to do is just give away all that land. Then you've got an article here in the Times about Kellogg's approach to matters, and this is going down very badly as well. What's the matter with these people, says one source here. Right, okay, so we have Trump envoy, we can divide Ukraine like post-war Berlin. So this has then sent people up the Swanee. People aren't liking this. That map is doing a bit of a viral round at the moment, which is to say that there's this front line here, but actually the Ukrainian army is concentrating on the northern border, and also down the eastern and southern fronts along to the Zaporizhia reservoir, and then international forces take over for defending that land. That's what he sees it like. But this will be after a negotiated ceasefire, you would think. You could almost make it look like what happened after Berlin with World War II, when you had a Russian zone, a French zone, and a British zone, a US zone, he said. If you're west of Dnipro, which is a major obstacle, Kellogg said, he later clarified that America would be providing any would not be providing any ground forces. He suggested that a demilitarized zone of 18 miles will be implemented along the existing lines of control in the east. Implicit in Kellogg's proposals is the acknowledgement that Ukraine will have to cede its eastern territories that are under Russian control. So this is coming from Keith Kellogg, who apparently just said that's not even possible, given what Witkoff has come away saying. So it's just incredible. Anyway, the remarks give one of the clearest insights into Trump's vision for the future of Ukraine from those involved in ceasefire planning. They are also the first suggestion from a senior US official, although actually this looks like ceasefire planning, so it's not that there's long-term control, that they're going to give away these areas. So this is what would happen if there's a ceasefire and then you go into negotiations, right? Yes, Ukraine would be inviting allies to provide a reassurance force in the west of the country. There's no suggestion that any further territories would be handed to Russia, while the analogy is loose. The symbolism of the language is striking, only weeks away from the 80th anniversary of VE Day. So the idea that this is like Berlin. And it came as Steve Witkoff, Trump's de facto Russia envoy, travelled to Russia on Friday to discuss that deal. The same day, Trump added pressure on Putin at the end of the war with a statement that Russia needs to get moving. But yeah, so anyway, lots of controversy about this. You've got natural resources of Ukraine there, a lot of them up in Donetsk, and then right throughout here to the north and going to the west. But yeah, so huge article in the Times. I'm not going to go into it all now, but actually then we've had Keith Kellogg then getting quite a lot of pressure here. David D. What the F? Plan floated by Kellogg. Not happy. A lot of people not happy with this. And then you've had, I love this from NAFO back, which is actually, how about putting the demilitarized zone the other side of the border? Stuff General Cornflake. Screw Envoy Witkoff. This is a proper peace plan. The fella plan, says Edward Hunter Christie. F the morons from the USA. Here's a legit plan since 2023. It has my seal of approval, I can tell you that. So I'll have to wait and see. Keith Kellogg has then responded to the Times article. Quote, "This article misrepresents what I said. I was speaking of a post-ceasefire resiliency force in support of Ukraine's sovereignty. When discussing partitioning, I meant zones of responsibility for an allied force without US troops, not dividing Ukraine." So that's that difference. This is not like Russia get to keep all that and Ukraine is divided up. It's just like how you manage a ceasefire and what forces you could put in place, etc., etc. So there's a difference between him and Witkoff there still. But yeah, pretty fractious times, because the Americans appear to want to do things regarding Ukraine that the Ukrainians are not going to be up for doing. And Steve Witkoff needs to basically jog on. Anyway, that's enough from me. Not a lot of talk about losses and hits and losses and strikes going on, because it's been a relatively quiet 24 hours, but quite a bit on the ongoing peace negotiations, especially as I probably won't have a chance to talk about this later today. Hopefully that was of use to you. Thank you so much, as ever, for getting your news from me. I really do appreciate it. You guys are amazing. I did a live stream last night that gave you a geopolitical update. Please go and check that out if you haven't already. It was a live stream, so it might not pop up on your feed. You might have to go to the homepage and look at my past live streams near the top of the page, and that would be great. That was a big old video talking about an awful lot of stuff, so you can go and listen to that while doing the mowing the lawn or whatever. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.